Assalamu alaikum students, welcome back to class. As we come towards the close of this semester, we have a couple of short stories left by H.G. Wells. The one that we're going to be doing today is titled The Man Who Could Work Miracles. But before I launch into the text of the story, let me quickly take you back and see how we can recap what we have done in this module. We started off with Jonathan Swift's travelogue, Gulliver's Travels, and we did his voyage to Lilliput. And if you remember from what I said at that time, that's just one of the voyages that we have done. And what I would like you to do, ideally speaking, is to go back and read more of Gulliver's Travels and see what other lands he visited, see what other peoples he visited. A brief introduction to this I gave you when we were doing Gulliver's Travels, and there were mention of the other peoples that he had met. And after we had finished the voyage to the land of the Lilliputians, we started off with short stories. And in the introduction to the short story, I told you that the short story is a form of literature which developed later than the other genres. So that we have the beginning in the early 19th century, and then it sort of takes on as a form, and you have the different types of short stories that have been written by British writers, French short story writers, Russian short story writers, and a lot of work, of course, was done in America on the short story. And we have already done two of the very famous American short story writers, Edgar Allan Poe and Mark Twain. The stories that we're currently doing are by H.G. Wells. And when we were doing the first short story by H.G. Wells, I pointed out to you the fact that H.G. Wells is renowned because he dealt with topics that later came to be classified as sci-fi or science fiction. Not all his short stories are concerned with science fiction, but H.G. Wells is one of those pioneers of science fiction whose stories we grow up on, and yet living in the 21st century, we feel that much of what he imagined in the 19th century is a fact in the 21st century. He talks about gadgets, he talks about electronic wizardry, and you see that those are things that you see around you all the time, and it's not even as if those are things which are, let's say, exceptional. They are part of daily use. But let us come to the story that we have in our text today, and that is The Man Who Could Work Miracles. Now, when you are confronted with the idea of someone working miracles, at once the thought that comes to your mind is that there's either some trick involved or it's black magic. Tricks can be understood, you can do them and you can undo them. Black magic is something different because there you have the forces of evil being called upon to do some minor adjustments. So without further ado, let us launch into the text of The Man Who Could Work Miracles. There are quite a few slides, and some of them we'll have to go through faster than the others. So let's work on the text. And Wells starts off by saying, it is doubtful whether the gift was innate. For my own part, I think it came to him suddenly. Indeed, until he was 30, he was a skeptic and did not believe in miraculous powers. Now you see, the way in which Wells introduces his theme and his central character is by referring to him as the third person pronoun. He does not take any names, he doesn't give any background, he launches into the story straight away. And since this is the most convenient place, I must mention that he was a little man and had eyes of a hot brown, very erect red hair, a mustache with ends that he twisted up, and freckles. Somehow freckles are supposed to make you look less serious. So he gives the description, but even now there is no name. And it is in the second paragraph that H.G. Wells gives us the name, and the name of the central character is George McWhirter Fotheringay. A big name for a small man. Wells has already told us that he was a little man, not the sort of name by any means to lead to any expectations of miracles, and he was clerk at Gumshots. So he wasn't a big man in the sense that you have a person who occupies an important position, who has either social or other types of significance in his own community. So he's a clerk at Gumshots and a little man with a big name. It was while he was asserting the impossibility of miracles that he had his first intimation of his extraordinary powers. So straight away you know that this is going to be a story in which you have some extraordinary powers displayed. This particular argument was being held in the bar of the Long Dragon, and Toddy Beamish was conducting the opposition by a monotonous but effective "so you say" that drove Mr. Fotheringay to the very limit of his patience. So there are always people who will drive you up the wall with that very irritating habit that they have. So Toddy Beamish had this habit of saying "so you say," which really made people mad at him, and this "so you say" is what drives Fotheringay to the very limit of his patience. There were present besides these two a very dusty cyclist, landlord Cox, that's the landlord of the bar or the tavern, and Miss Maybridge, the perfectly respectable and rather portly barmaid of the Dragon. So he's in the bar, and these are the people who surround him while he has this conversation with Toddy Beamish. Miss Maybridge was standing with her back to Mr. Fotheringay, washing glasses. That's part of her work. The others were watching him, more or less amused by the present ineffectiveness of the assertive method. So he's not being very effectual. Toddy Beamish is going on with his "so you say" with every sentence, and that drives Fotheringay up the walls. And Fotheringay starts off again and he says, "Look here, Mr. Beamish, let us clearly understand what a miracle is. It's something contrariwise to the course of nature, done by power of will, something what couldn't happen without being specially willed." So this is Fotheringay's explanation of what a miracle is. And Mr. Beamish comes up with that very irritating "so you say." So in other words, what he's saying is that this is Fotheringay's description of what a miracle is. Mr. Fotheringay appealed to the cyclist, who had hitherto been a silent auditor, and received his assent, given with a hesitating cough and a glance at Mr. Beamish. So the landlord expresses no opinion. The cyclist says, okay, I'm with you. And Mr. Fotheringay, returning to Mr. Beamish, received the unexpected concession of a qualified assent to his definition of a miracle. So then Mr. Fotheringay says, for instance, here would be a miracle. That lamp in the course of nature couldn't burn like that upside down, could it, Mr. Beamish? So he points to a lamp and he says, you know, that lamp is burning. If it were to turn upside down and still continue burning, would that not be a miracle? And Beamish says, you say that it could not burn upside down? And Fotheringay says, what do you say? Do you think that if we turn this lamp upside down, it will continue to burn, or you think that it's going to go off? And Fotheringay says, here comes someone, you know, somebody like me, for example, who stands here and who says to that lamp, turn upside down without breaking and go on burning steadily. And hello, it was enough to make anyone say hello. The impossible, the incredible was visible to them all. So what had happened was the lamp had turned upside down and it was still burning. It was that prosaic common lamp in the Long Dragon bar. So everybody is astonished and nobody knows what to do. The cyclist who was sitting next to the lamp, he jumped across the bar. Now you see, this kind of thing is so scary. Everyone reacts in a different way. The cyclist jumps across the bar and H.G. Wells says everybody jumped more or less. Miss Maybridge, of course, who's the barmaid, she turns and she screams, and you know, it's something that is a shock for everyone, because the kind of conversation that they've been having is very normal. There's one person who believes in miracle, another who doesn't. So nothing very special about this conversation. But nevertheless, when Fotheringay says, you know, if somebody like me were to tell that lamp to turn upside down and continue burning, it would do it. And while he is speaking, the lamp turns upside down and burns steadily. For nearly 3 seconds, the lamp remains still. And then Fotheringay says, I can't keep it up any longer. So he staggers because his will is broken. That sustained order from his brain is going to the lamp, but that is broken because he gets tired. And of course the lamp falls because the lamp is still upside down. He does not will it to turn the right side. Because the lamp is upside down, it falls, it breaks. And the only reason why the whole place doesn't catch fire is because it had a metal receiver. Okay, now this thing, when it happens, it shocks not only the people present in the bar, it shocks Fotheringay himself, because this is something that he could not have imagined, and yet it happens in front of many different people, and Fotheringay just doesn't know what to do. So the general opinion, and of course then there's a conversation that breaks out, and there's a very sort of enthusiastic discussion. The general opinion not only followed Mr. Cox very closely, but very vehemently. Everyone accused Fotheringay of a silly trick and presented him as a foolish destroyer of comfort and security. So they did not believe that it was a miracle. They just thought it was a trick that he had done, and they said, you know, you're a bad man, you shouldn't have done this, and you've upset everyone, and look at the mess you've made on the floor, etc., etc. To the extent that poor Mr. Fotheringay, remember, he's just a clerk. Poor Mr. Fotheringay is so upset that he goes home in a very confused state of mind. He was inclined to agree with all those people who were saying that it was a trick, although he knew it was not. So he goes home, he's excited, he's tense, he's nervous, his very appearance shows that he's confused and nervous. He watched each of the 10 street lamps nervously as he passed it. You know, he kept on thinking, maybe these lamps will turn upside down. It's only when he gets home to his bedroom that he sort of can collect himself and becomes calm. And that is when he asks himself, what on earth happened? By this time he had removed his coat and boots, and he was sitting on the bed repeating the text of his defense for the 17th time. And the text of his defense was, I didn't want the confounded thing to upset. He didn't want to turn the lamp upside down, but the will to do it was there, and therefore the lamp turned upside down, and after 3 seconds it smashed to pieces. So so much for that first miracle. Mr. Fotheringay did not have a very complex mind, in the sense that he could not spend a long time debating issues. His was a very simple mind, and simple things appealed to him. He doesn't know what happened. He thinks that it was a trick, mainly because everybody else is saying he's a trick. So he doesn't have a mind that can work for himself. He needs to be guided all the time. And Wells says that this recollection, or this thinking back over what had happened in the morning, makes Fotheringay think of what he has done and why he has done it. So in order to test himself, he points to his candle and collects his mind, though he felt he did a foolish thing. Be raised up, he said. In a second that feeling vanished. But the candle was raised, hung in the air, and as Mr. Fotheringay gasped, the candle fell with a smash on his toilet table, and there was total darkness. So you can't just will something to happen and then let go of that object. You have to make sure that whatever you are willing, it stays, and it is properly managed. So when he does the same thing with the candle, and the candle smashes on the dressing table, leaving him in darkness, Fotheringay starts looking around for matches, and then, you know, the idea comes to him that if he could work a miracle with a candle and a lamp, maybe he can do it with the matches also. So then he says, I wish I had a match, and you know, he holds out his hand and says, let there be a match in that hand, and then he feels something falling into his hand, and that is a matchstick. So when he starts to light the candle, you know, he discovers that it's a safety match, and that it will not light unless it is rubbed on a particular surface. So then he starts thinking, maybe I don't need a match, maybe I just can will it to burn. So then what he does is he wills the candle to be lit, and it is lit. So then he goes out and he starts thinking of what else he can do, because this has opened up a whole vista of possibilities. He sees a little black hole in the toilet cover, and he finds out that there's a hole that's been burned into it. So then he stops and he wants to think. What is happening? What is he doing? and what can he do possibly in the future. So Wells says that the subsequent meditations of Mr. Fotheringay were of a severe but confused description. So far he could see it was a case of pure willing with him. The nature of his experiences so far disinclined him for any further experiments. So because he's a clerk, you know, he's not a very ambitious person, he's not a very highly placed official, so it's very difficult for him to adjust to the idea that he has power to make things happen. He lifts a sheet of paper, he turns a glass of water pink and then green, and he creates a snail whom he annihilates, he destroys it, and he gets himself a miraculous new toothbrush. So he's small scale, you know, these are petty things that he is doing, but that is the extent of his mind. His mind will not go beyond that to greater things. So when he recovers from this discovery, he becomes aware that the church clock was striking 1:01. That means that he had been out for a very long time, and he wanted to get back home in time so that he got his required sleep. It's 1 o'clock. He has to be at the office early, so he comes back home, undresses, gets into bed, and then he struggles with the shirt over his head. He gets the idea, let me be in bed. So then the next moment he finds himself in bed, undressed. So that means that he doesn't even want to take off his own clothes. And then he realizes that it's cold. So then he says, in my nightshirt, no, in a nice soft woolen nightshirt. And so lo and behold, he is in a nice soft woolen nightshirt. He awoke at his usual hour and was pensive all through breakfast time, wondering whether his overnight experience might not be a particularly vivid dream. So he wakes up in the morning and he starts thinking, maybe it was a dream, maybe things didn't actually happen the way I think they did. So, you know, he is dealing with things that are very small, but things that are within his grasp. Now you need to remember that he's a clerk. He's a clerk who's working in a company. So he's one of those very insignificant people about whom there is no individuality, and therefore those people are never are never important enough to be noticed. So when he starts performing these miracles, they're very small scale. You know, his landlady gives him 2 eggs for breakfast. He has another one freshly laid and cooked and served, and this one is a goose egg. The others are probably chicken eggs. So he just sort of doesn't want to reveal to anyone what he can do at this stage, because he's not sure of his powers himself, and nobody asks him about anything, so he doesn't volunteer anything, except perhaps that his landlady asks him at night, where did you get the 3rd egg, and where did you get a goose egg? So she's the only one who questions him, and that is because she knows that she has supplied him only with 2 eggs. So he goes to Gumshots for duty. He's there the whole day, but he is thinking all the time of how he got thrown out of the Long Dragon, how he ended up by performing miracles through sheer willpower. Now, because he is a little man, because he is not of any significance in society, the things that he thinks about are also very small. They're very minor, petty things. So he intends to increase his property by just thinking about it, by willing himself to do it. So he calls into existence a pair of very splendid diamond stud, you know, cufflinks that men folk wear. He wills a pair of diamond cufflinks, and then, you know, he's scared because the owner of Gumshots is coming towards him, so he quickly wills it to be destroyed, and the diamond studs are destroyed. So that is when he realizes that this gift of performing miracles needs to be used with caution and care, and he'd have to be very, very specific about where he uses it and very careful as to how he goes about it. So after supper, he goes out of the house because he intends to test his powers, and he's afraid of doing it inside the house. So he runs the usual gamut. He brings certain things to him through sheer willpower, and then he thinks of turning his walking stick into Moses, going back to the story of Moses in the First Testament, the prophet, and how he turned his walking stick into the biggest snake possible, so that that ate up all the snakes that came under that were a part of the magic that the Pharaoh was making. So what he does is that he commands his walking stick to blossom, and immediately he can smell the blossoms. At this moment, he hears footsteps approaching, and he finds out that it is the constable who tells him not to disturb the peace of the community. So he gets these powers, but he can't decide what to do with them. You know, he's very confused, he's nervous, he's tense. So when he commands his walking stick to turn to bloom, at once he can smell the perfume of flowers, and then he gets into a panic and he says, go back. Now what he means to say is change back, but when he says go back, the stick recedes with a very rapid speed and goes and hits whom? The police constable, who is on duty, who is doing a patrol. So he calls out and says, who are you throwing sticks at? And Fotheringay says, I'm sorry, you know, I didn't mean to hit you. And he finds out that it is Constable Winch. And Constable Winch is one person that Fotheringay does not want to antagonize. And you see how Winch sort of thinks that this is personal. And although Mr. Fotheringay continues to apologize, he does not take his apologies very seriously, and he says, you know, you've done this deliberately, and what you have done is equal to assaulting the police, and assaulting the police is a major crime. So Fotheringay is very confused, and he says, I don't know what to do, but you know, the fact is that I was working a miracle. Now the moment he says that, Winch says, who are you trying to fool? What what miracles are you talking about? That's a lot of rubbish. And so he starts scolding Fotheringay, and Fotheringay just sort of catches himself when he says, you know, I was working on miracles, and he is so confused that he turns around in the constable and says, I've had enough of this, and you know, you don't know who you're talking about, go to Hades. Now Hades was a reference to hell, the underworld, and so the constable, I suppose, goes to Hades, and then Mr. Fotheringay realizes what he has done. You know, he sent a person to hell, not realizing whether he actually deserves to be there or not. And so then when he gets back home and he sits on the bed and he's taking off his boots, he just has this idea that I'm going to will him to be in San Francisco instead of Hades. And so he can sleep a peaceful night's sleep because he has transferred winch from Hades to San Francisco. And then in the night, you know, he dreams about Winch and his anger. Although he doesn't have anything to fear from him, he has this power of willing anything in this world. So in spite of the fact that the next day he hears two interesting bits of news, one is that there is that rose vine that is climbing up the wall of Mr. Gumshot's private house, and the other is that the police are going to drag the river for the body of Constable Winch. Throughout the day, Mr. Fotheringay is confused, he's tense, he's nervous, and he makes no miracles except for certain provisions for Winch. And you know, he finishes his work fast, but he doesn't have the same amount of satisfaction. So Fotheringay goes one Sunday evening to the church, to the chapel, and although he is not a regular church goer, something happens that makes him convinced that he needs to discuss his powers with someone. And as it is, the sermon that is delivered that day is on how to use your powers. So once the sermon is over, Fotheringay talks to the priest and he says, I need a little time, there's something that I have to discuss. So he waits until everyone has gone, and then he goes into Mr. Maydig, who is the priest, and he goes to meet him. And when he's there, the first thing that he starts off with is that you don't think that a man, an ordinary man like me, might have some sort of power that would allow him to do things purely by willing them. And Mr. Maydig says it's possible. Something of the sort perhaps is possible. And then Fotheringay goes further into his explanation, and he says, you know, that tobacco jar on the table, supposing I were to change that into something else, would you consider that a miracle or not? And while he is saying that, he wills the tobacco jar to turn into a bowl of violets, a bowl of flowers. So instantly the tobacco jar turns into a bowl of violets. And Mr. Maydig is shocked, and he looks at Mr. Fotheringay and he says, "How did you do that?" So Fotheringay says, "I don't know, I just willed it to be there and that has happened. Do you think that this is a miracle?" And Maydig says, "I don't know if it's a miracle or not, but it's a very extraordinary thing to happen. Things like that don't happen here, don't happen in this world." And Fotheringay says, "You know, last week, this time, I knew nothing about this. And yet, here I am sitting before you and trying to convince you that I can work miracles." So at once Maydig says, "Are there any other things that you can do apart from turning things upside down and etc., etc.? And Fotheringay says, "Lord, yes, I can do anything." So then he changes the bowl of fish into a glass bowl full of water with goldfish swimming in it. Then he changes it into a pigeon, all the while surprising Mr. Maydig. So then he changes that into a pigeon, he changes it back into a bowl of flowers, and then he changes it back into the tobacco jar, which was what it originally was. So Mr. Fotheringay hands the tobacco jar to Mr. Maydig. Mr. Maydig examines it, and he is still at a loss for explanation. And then Fotheringay launches into this long explanation, bringing in the long dragon, what happened with the lamp there, etc., etc. All this while, Mr. Maydig is listening very, very carefully, and this is when he starts to make his plan. He says it is credible, it is amazing, of course, but it reconciles a number of amazing possibility. The power to work miracles is a gift, a peculiar quality like genius or second sight, and it has come very rarely and to exceptional people. But in this case, I have always wondered at the miracles of Muhammad and at Yogi's miracles and the miracles of Madame Blavatsky. So this discussion is taking place between Fotheringay and Maydig, and all the time Maydig is thinking, what can he get Fotheringay to do? So and here is where H.G. Wells talks directly about priests, because you see that Mr. Maydig turns out to be a very strong influence on Fotheringay. And throughout it all, Fotheringay is upset by the thought of having sent Mr. Winch to San Francisco, and then he starts thinking, you know, I don't know what has happened to Mr. Winch, I don't know how cold it is, I don't know if he has clothes to wear, I don't know if he has food to eat or not. Maybe he's just wandering the streets of Fotheringay, and if he would have been better in a place like Hades. So they have this discussion, and it's something that is very that opens up a whole avenue of challenges for Mr. Maydig and Mr. Fotheringay. So they have the discussion about Constable Winch, and you see that Fotheringay, because you know he's used to thinking of the little things, the little details. So he thinks of the little details when he thinks of Mr. Winch. And he keeps on thinking, I don't know if he has food, I don't know if he's cold or whatever. So this is the kind of discussion that he's having with Mr. Maydig, who assures him that it is not a criminal act, and who at the same time keeps thinking of how he can use this power that Fotheringay has, and that is denied to Mr. Maydig. So while Fotheringay is worrying about Constable Winch, Maydig is thinking of what they can do, and he says that this is something that is very powerful, and I want to see how we can use this power that you have. Fotheringay is concerned all the time about the little things, the details. Like he says, you know, you saw how I changed the tobacco jar into a bowl of goldfish. It was the wrong type of fish, it was the wrong type of bowl. Now these are the things that he is thinking about. Maydig is not thinking about that. Maydig all along is thinking of how they can use this power to bring about changes. So as H.G. Wells says, on Sunday, November 10th, 1896, Mr. Fotheringay, inspired and egged on by Mr. Maydig, began to work miracles. And here is what he got done. Now, Wells here says that the details immediately following may be difficult to accept, but the fact is that these things actually happened. Miracles do happen, and you just need to have a mind that is open enough to accept these. So when they began, they were very timid little miracles, like things that were concerned with, let's say, cups and parlor fitments, as feeble as the miracles of the Theosophists. And here, of course, Wells is very, very critical about the Theosophists, but with practice, Maydig and Fotheringay keep thinking of other things that need to be done. So as his power grows, so does Fotheringay's imagination, so does Maydig's imagination. And the first miracle that concerns them, the first big miracle that they bring about, is about Mr. Fotheringay's housekeeper. So first what they do is they have a sumptuous meal brought in, and then Mr. Maydig says that, you know, this is not the right way. Actually, my problem is my housekeeper. So then what they do is Fotheringay wills the housekeeper to change, and and there's this sound coming from upstairs where the housekeeper is sleeping, and when Maydig runs upstairs and peeps into the housekeeper's bedroom, he sees that the housekeeper has taken out a bottle of brandy that she was drinking on the sly, and she goes and throws this bottle of brandy, and she starts praying that she will be forgiven, for she has committed a sin. And once that happens, Mr. Maydig is sort of satisfied. But see, the thing here is that it does not stop here. Their imagination grows, and from food, from dinner, they start thinking of other things that they can get changed. And then, you know, this is, they bring about certain changes, they bring about certain miracles that that seem to them worth doing, and they bring about changes in the town that could not have been possible without Fotheringay's intervention. So for them, in the beginning, it's enough to have the housekeeper changing and becoming a very honest woman. But as their imagination grows, so do their ideas of what needs to be done and how far they need to be benevolent. So Mr. Maydig has some very brilliant ideas, but Mr. Fotheringay is very hesitant. So here's a list of some of the things that they do when they go out. They improve the railway communication of the place. They drain Flinders Swamp because the swamp breeds all kinds of disease, and it's an unhealthy thing to have there. They improve the soil of One Tree Hill, and then they cure the vicar's wart. So railway communication on the one hand, and a wart on the face or the body of the vicar or the priest on the other. So they had the little things going, and they had those huge projects doing. And then they start thinking of what they can do for the injured peer. So while they are working on these things, Mr. Fotheringay looks at his watch and he says, you know, it's 3 o'clock and I have to be back in the office at 8 in the morning. Remember, he's still a clerk at Gumshots. They've been working all night on these miracles, and now he knows that he has to go back to his place of work. So Mr. Maydig says, you know, we're only beginning. There's so much work that needs to be done. Why is it important for you to go to Gumshots at 8 in the morning? And Mr. Fotheringay says, but I have to go to work. So Mr. Maydig instigates him to stop time. And that proves to be the undoing of both Mr. Fotheringay and Mr. Maydig, because he looks up at the moon and here's what he says. He says, now just stop rotating, will you? So what he's doing is he is telling the earth to stop rotating. And when he does that, he doesn't realize what it's going to entail. So the earth stops rotating. Now when the earth stops rotating, there is chaos and confusion over the earth. And the first thing that Fotheringay realizes is that he's flying head over heels through the air at 12 miles per minute. You see, it's unimaginable. If the earth stops rotating, then everything that is on the surface of the earth will be affected. It will affect animal life, it will affect plant life, it will affect inanimate objects, everything, the climate, the water on the surface of the earth, everything and anything will be affected. So Fotheringay finds himself flying through the air, and there's these huge masses of objects and of trees being uprooted. It's like there's a tornado, there's strong winds blowing, there are houses being blown hither and thither. Wells gives the example of a cow that smashes into some of the larger pieces of debris, and Fotheringay doesn't know what has happened. All that he asked for was the earth to stop rotating, but he doesn't realize, remember, he's a clerk, he doesn't realize that that is something that's going to bring on chaos on earth. It's not just one particular place that he's talking about. He is willing the earth to stop rotation, and that means that it's going to impact everything. And Fotheringay is confused, he is flabbergasted, and he says, where is Maydig? You know, Maydig is the one who brought me onto this, and I want to talk to him and to find out how I can put a stop to this. And then he says that, you know, the sky is all right, it's just the earth that's stopped moving. But then he hasn't said anything about the sky. He hasn't willed the sky to have a radical change. The moon is overhead as it was before. Where's the village? Where's anything? And what on earth set the wind blowing? He doesn't realize that he's responsible for these strong winds that are blowing. He doesn't realize anything because he has been following Mr. Maydig's instructions blindly. He has not thought about the consequences of stopping the globe from rotating. He struggles to get to his feet, but it's very difficult because there are such strong winds blowing. So he doesn't know what to do. He can't see anything. He can't even stand up. There are no trees, no houses, no familiar shapes. It's a total wilderness, and there is lightning and thunder and storm conditions. He sees something that might have been an elm tree. He sees the remains of iron girders, but everything is twisted, everything is broken, and he doesn't realize what a massive change had been brought about. He had not willed things to go on working as they are. He had just willed the earth to stop rotating, and the earth spins so fast. And here is where H.G. Wells brings in his science. He says the earth spins so fast that the surface of its equator is traveling at more than 1,000 miles an hour, and in these latitudes at more than half that pace. So that the village and Mr. Maydig and Mr. Fotheringay, everybody and everything had been jerked violently forward at about 9 miles per second. That is faster than if they had come out of a cannon, and every human being, every living creature, every horse and every tree had been jerked and smashed and utterly destroyed, and the only thing that is still left standing is Mr. Fotheringay himself. So he realized that his miracle had miscarried, and with that a great disgust of miracles came upon him, because he's a person who's not used to thinking far ahead of him. He has a limited intellectual ability, and he cannot deal with so much destruction being caused on earth as a result of something that he had said or done or even thought. So he just thinks of what has happened, of what he has been responsible for, and he blames Maydig, and he screams and he says, Maydig, Maydig, where are you? And he can't see Mr. Maydig. He's dead and gone, somewhere destroyed. And then he perceives this wall of water traveling towards him, and he says, stop just a moment while I collect my thoughts. And he doesn't know what to do. He says, what shall I do? What shall I do? And then he says, I am going to have it right this time. So then what he says is, let nothing what I am going to order happen until I say off. Lord, I wish I'd thought of that before. So he lifts his voice against the whirlwind and he says, okay, mind about that what I said just now. In the first place, when all I've got to say is done, let me lose my miraculous powers. Let my will become just like anybody else's will, and all these dangerous miracles be stopped. I don't like them. So this is what he wills. He says, I didn't work them. That's the first thing. And the second is, let me be back just before the miracles began, Let everything be just as it was before that blessed lamp turned up. It's a big job, but it's the last. So he wills that to happen, and he wills himself to be back in the Long Dragon bar just at that point before the lamp turned upside down. So he wills all that, and he says off. So everything becomes perfectly still, and he perceives that he's standing erect. Remember, he couldn't stand. There was that strong wind blowing from all possible sides, and what he hears is something that he really welcomes, and that is the voice of Toddy Beamish saying, "So you say." He opens his eyes, he looks around, he's still in the bar of the Long Dragon, and he's still arguing with Toddy Beamish. Now, he had a sense that something had happened, but he had no memory of what had happened. He knew nothing at all except the fact that he is arguing with Toddy Beamish, and he says, "I tell you that miracles can't possibly happen." Remember, he had willed himself not to believe that miracles can happen. And Toddy Beamish says, "That's what you think. Prove it if you can." Remember, Toddy Beamish is the one who says, "So you say," to everything that is said. So Fotheringay says, "Look here, Mr. Beamish, let us clearly understand what a miracle is," and that takes you back to the conversation that we started this lecture with, and that is Fotheringay and Toddy Beamish arguing about miracles in the Long Dragon bar. So that's where we started off, that's where the story ends, and all that has happened in the meantime has been H.G. Wells's description of what would happen if a man could work miracles just by willing certain things to happen. So before I go off, let me quickly recap what we've done today. The Man Who Could Work Miracles is a short story by H.G. Wells, and in this story he talks about these two men who are arguing in the Long Dragon bar, and what they're talking about is miracles. And Fotheringay says that miracles don't happen. There is no such thing as a miracle, because if a person like me, for example, could say that that lamp can turn upside down and still burn. Now, while he is saying this, the lamp does turn upside down, it continues to burn, and everybody is shocked, and this incident, this occurrence, leads to a sequence of events in consultation with the priest, Mr. Maydig, Fotheringay performs certain miracles to change the existing way of life. And it all ends when Fotheringay says that it's getting late, I need to get back home because I still have to go to work in the morning. And Mr. Maydig says, this could change if you were to stop the rotation of the earth, in other words, stop time. So when Fotheringay does that, there is chaos and confusion over the whole earth, and Fotheringay is thrown hither and thither, everything is utterly destroyed. And when Fotheringay sees what has happened and he can't see Mr. Maydig anywhere, he starts to rationalize and he starts to think that whatever he has done has been wrong. Then he decides to have it put right. So then he wills to have himself taken back to the point in time just before the lamp turns upside down, so that he can change this whole story. He can change the history of the earth. So he says that he wills himself to not to have that power to work miracles anymore, and then he realizes that he's gone back to the same point in time where he was arguing with Toddy Beamish about the authenticity of miracles. So he finds himself still at that point, and that is where this story comes to an end. So thank you for being patient. We have 2 more lectures left, and that will be the end of this semester. So I'll come back with another short story, and then 1 more, and that will be the end. So take care of yourself, and Allah Hafiz.